Nolan was driving home from a late shift at a tech company in Austin, Texas, in September 2020. The commute was usually 45 minutes of highway driving, mostly empty roads at 2 a.m. when his shift ended. He'd made this drive hundreds of times without incident, using the quiet time to decompress from work stress. Everything was normal until he stopped at a red light about 20 minutes into his drive. While waiting for the light to change, he adjusted his rear-view mirror and noticed something that made his blood freeze. The seatbelt in the back seat behind him was buckled. Nolan lived alone and never had passengers. He distinctly remembered the back seat being empty when he left work. He tossed his laptop bag back there as usual. But now the middle seatbelt was definitely fastened, pulled tight as if securing an invisible passenger. He pulled over immediately and got out to check.
Hey, hurry up yourself.
The back seat appeared empty, but when he reached to unbuckle the seatbelt, it wouldn't release. The buckle seemed stuck or locked in place. After several attempts, it finally clicked open. Nolan examined the entire car interior, looking for any explanation. Nothing seemed out of place except for one detail. The seat behind him was compressed, showing the clear impression of someone sitting there. The cushion held the shape of a person who weighed maybe 150, 160 pounds. He got back in and continued driving, checking his mirror constantly. The seat impression gradually returned to normal over the next few minutes, as if whatever had been sitting there was slowly getting up and moving around. That's when the car started responding to commands he wasn't giving. At the next intersection, Nolan intended to go straight, but his car turned right without his input. His hands were on the steering wheel, but it moved on its own, smoothly and deliberately, as if guided by someone else. He tried to correct the turn, but the wheel resisted his efforts. Not violently, more like someone was gently but firmly guiding him in a different direction. The car maintained perfect control, staying in the lane, obeying speed limits, driving better than most humans. For the next 15 minutes, Nolan's car took him through neighborhoods he'd never seen, following a route that seemed to have specific purpose. He could steer when the invisible force allowed it, but major directional decisions were being made by something else. The really disturbing part was the sensation that someone was leaning forward from the back seat, looking over his shoulder. He couldn't see anything in his peripheral vision, but he felt breath on the back of his neck. Warm, steady breathing that didn't match his own rhythm. Occasionally, he heard soft sounds from behind him. The leather seats creaking slightly, fabric rustling as if someone was adjusting their position. Once he was certain he heard fingers drumming impatiently on the door armrest. "Where are we going?" Nolan finally asked aloud, feeling ridiculous for talking to empty air. The response came as a sudden change in the car's behavior. Instead of the gentle guidance he'd been experiencing, the vehicle accelerated rapidly and began taking turns more aggressively. Whatever was controlling his car had become agitated. They ended up in a residential area Nolan had never visited, pulling into the driveway of a modest two-story house. The car stopped and the engine turned off, though Nolan hadn't touched the key. He sat in the driveway for several minutes, unsure what was expected of him. The house was dark, no signs of life, looking like it might be vacant. But he could feel expectation from the presence in his back seat, as if he was supposed to understand something important. Finally, he restarted the car. This time, the steering responded normally to his control. He backed out of the driveway and began trying to find his way home, using his phone's GPS for navigation. But every time he tried to follow the GPS directions, the car would subtly resist, making turns feel difficult or causing the engine to hesitate. The invisible passenger clearly didn't want him to leave yet. Nolan drove around the neighborhood for another hour, with his unwanted passenger occasionally guiding him past specific houses. Each time they passed certain addresses, he could feel increased attention from the back seat, as if the presence was remembering or searching for something. Around 4 a.m., the guidance stopped. The seatbelt behind him buckled itself one more time, then immediately released. The seat impression deepened for a moment, then returned to normal. His car suddenly felt empty in a way it hadn't for hours. Nolan drove home without further incident, but when he arrived, he found something that still gives him chills. On his passenger seat was a folded piece of paper with an address written in handwriting he didn't recognize. It was the address of the house where his car had first stopped. He researched the address online and discovered that a 34-year-old man named David had died in a car accident 6 months earlier. The house had been his residence. According to the accident report, David had been driving home from work when another vehicle ran a red light and killed him instantly. The accident happened at the same intersection where Nolan first noticed the buckled seatbelt. Nolan never experienced another incident like that, but he sold his car 3 weeks later. He couldn't shake the feeling that David was still trying to get home, still buckling his seatbelt for a journey that would never end. And sometimes, late at night, Nolan wonders if David found another ride. Axel was driving the Pacific Coast Highway from Los Angeles to Seattle in August 2019, planning to take his time and enjoy the scenic route. He'd driven PCH before during daylight and knew how beautiful the coastline could be. What he didn't anticipate was how menacing those same vistas would feel at 1 a.m. He was somewhere between Monterey and San Francisco, navigating the winding cliff-top road in dense fog when he first noticed the figure on the beach below. Highway 1 runs right along the coastline in many sections with dramatic drops to rocky beaches and pounding surf. The fog was so thick he could barely see the ocean, but occasionally it would thin enough to reveal glimpses of the shoreline. During one of these clear moments, his headlights illuminated a person standing motionless on the beach about 50 feet below the road. Unusual given the time and location, but not necessarily alarming. Maybe someone camping or having car trouble. What bothered Axel was the figure's posture. It stood facing the road, not the ocean, arms at its sides, perfectly still, as if it had been placed there specifically to watch passing traffic. 5 minutes later, around the next bend, the fog cleared again. The same figure was on the beach below, in exactly the same position, same posture, same orientation toward the road. That was impossible. The figure would have had to climb up the cliff, run along the highway faster than Axel was driving, then climb back down to the beach, all in dense fog, on treacherous terrain, in complete darkness. But there it was. Over the next hour, as Axel navigated the serpentine coastal road, the figure appeared on beaches below him 8 more times, always in the same position, always facing the road, always perfectly motionless. Sometimes the sightings were separated by miles of highway, yet the figure somehow kept appearing ahead of his route. Axel began driving faster, pushing his limits on the dangerous, fog-shrouded curves. He wanted to outpace whatever game was being played, but speed didn't matter. Every time the fog lifted enough to see the coastline, the figure was there, waiting, watching. Around 2:30 a.m. north of Santa Cruz, Axel decided to stop. He found a pull-out area with a clear view down to the beach and grabbed his phone to record evidence of whatever was happening. The fog was particularly thick, but he could make out the general shape of the shoreline below. He waited with his camera ready, engine running, prepared to document the impossible. When the fog finally parted, the beach was empty. Relief flooded through him. Maybe he'd been seeing things, getting spooked by an ordinary explanation. Driftwood, rock formations, shadows playing tricks in the mist. He put his phone away and prepared to continue driving. That's when he saw movement, much closer than the beach. The figure was climbing up the cliff face directly below his car, not scrambling or struggling like a human would on the steep, rocky cliff, moving with deliberate, controlled precision, finding handholds that shouldn't exist, ascending at a steady pace that defied the terrain's difficulty. Axel watched in frozen terror as the figure climbed closer to road level. In the dim glow of his dashboard lights, he could see more details. Tall, thin build, clothes that looked dark and form-fitting, but the most disturbing aspect was its movement. Too fluid, too graceful for human physiology. When the figure reached a point about 10 feet below the roadway, it stopped climbing and looked up directly at Axel's car. Even through the fog and darkness, he could feel its attention like a physical weight. They stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then the figure resumed climbing with increased speed, heading directly for Axel's position. Axel floored the accelerator and peeled out of the pullout, tires screaming on the wet asphalt. In his rear-view mirror, he saw a shape emerge from the cliff edge onto the roadway exactly where his car had been parked. The chase that followed was the most terrifying hour of Axel's life. Every few minutes, he'd spot the figure ahead of him on the road, standing in his lane, forcing him to swerve around it. Each time, the figure would be closer than before. Sometimes it would be only 20 or 30 feet ahead when his headlights caught it. But here's what made the encounter truly nightmarish. The figure never moved when his headlights hit it. It would just stand there, arms at its sides, facing his approaching car with apparent indifference to the 2-ton vehicle bearing down on it. Each time Axel swerved to avoid impact, he'd check his mirrors to see the figure standing in the road behind him, watching his taillights disappear. The encounter stopped abruptly when Axel reached the outskirts of San Francisco. As soon as he started seeing other traffic and urban lighting, the figure vanished. The rest of his drive to Seattle was uneventful, but Axel sold his car when he got home and has never driven PCH at night again. He researches his routes carefully now, avoiding isolated coastal highways after dark, because somewhere along that fog-shrouded stretch of California coastline, something inhuman patrols the beaches and cliffs, watching for lone travelers. Something that can move faster than physics should allow and has no fear of cars, cliffs, or consequences. Something that's still down there, waiting for the next driver brave enough to travel the Pacific Coast Highway alone in the dark. Corbin was driving through rural Montana in October 2022, traveling from Billings to Missoula for a weekend hiking trip. He'd chosen to drive at night to avoid traffic and make better time on the winding mountain roads. His route took him through some of the most isolated territory in the lower 48 states, areas where cell service was spotty and other vehicles were rare. About 3 hours into the drive, while adjusting his rearview mirror to check for traffic, Corbin noticed something that shouldn't have been there. In the reflection, he could see someone sitting in his back seat. Not clearly, more like a shadow or silhouette, but definitely the shape of a person. Corbin immediately turned around to look directly at the back seat. It was empty, but when he looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there. This impossible situation continued for several minutes. Direct visual inspection showed an empty back seat. Mirror reflection showed an occupied back seat. Corbin tested this repeatedly, turning to look back, then checking the mirror. The results were consistent and terrifying. The figure in his mirror appeared to be a woman, maybe middle-aged, wearing what looked like a coat or jacket. She sat perfectly still, facing forward, as if she was a normal passenger on a normal drive, but she only existed in reflective surfaces. Corbin tried adjusting his other mirrors to get different angles. His side mirrors showed the same thing: a passenger who wasn't there. The woman appeared in every reflective surface in the car, but could not be seen with direct vision. Then she began moving. In his rearview mirror, Corbin watched the woman lean forward, as if trying to look over his shoulder at the road ahead. He could see her clearly in the reflection: brown hair, tired eyes, an expression of intense concentration. But when he turned to look directly at where she should be, nothing. The movement continued. She would shift positions, sometimes leaning against the window, sometimes sitting straight up, occasionally turning her head as if looking at the scenery passing by. All visible in mirrors, all impossible to see directly. After about 30 minutes of this surreal experience, the woman in the mirror began trying to get Corbin's attention. She was waving her hands, pointing forward at the road, becoming increasingly agitated about something. Corbin looked ahead but saw nothing unusual. Clear highway, good visibility, no obstacles or hazards. But the woman in his mirror was now frantically gesturing, pointing at something he couldn't identify. That's when he realized she wasn't pointing at the road. She was pointing at his mirrors. In his side mirror, Corbin could now see headlights behind him. A vehicle was approaching fast, much faster than safe for the winding mountain highway. But when he looked directly out his back window, the road behind him was completely dark. The approaching vehicle existed only in mirrors, just like his passenger. The headlights got closer, and Corbin could see in his mirrors that it was a large truck, probably a semi, traveling at dangerous speed and showing no signs of slowing down. In the mirror, it looked like a collision was inevitable, but outside his mirrors, Corbin's car was alone on a dark highway. The woman in his back seat was now hitting the window, trying to get his attention, pointing urgently at the approaching truck that only existed in reflections. Her mouth was moving, shouting words he couldn't hear, her face showing obvious panic. Corbin made a split-second decision. Even though his eyes told him the road was clear, he swerved his car onto the shoulder, following the warning from his mirror passenger. The moment his car left the main lane, he felt something massive pass by. A rush of wind, a sense of enormous weight moving at high speed, the ground vibration of heavy machinery. But he saw nothing with his direct vision. In his mirrors, he watched a phantom semi-truck roar past, its driver clearly struggling to control the vehicle on the winding road. The truck's trailer was swaying dangerously, and it disappeared around the next curve at a speed that would have made collision certain if Corbin hadn't moved. The woman in his back seat was now looking directly at him in the mirror, nodding approvingly. For the first time, she smiled, a sad but grateful expression that spoke of relief and recognition. Then she began to fade. Over the next few minutes, her reflection became dimmer, less distinct. She was still there, but becoming translucent, as if whatever force had brought her into his mirrors was weakening. Before she disappeared completely, the woman pressed her hand against the back window. In the mirror, Corbin could see her handprint clearly, fogging the glass with what looked like breath or condensation. She wrote something in the fog, letters that appeared backwards in the mirror but spelled out "thank you" when read correctly. Then she was gone. Corbin drove the rest of the way to Missoula without further incident, but when he arrived, he researched accidents on that stretch of highway. He found multiple reports of fatal crashes involving vehicles that had inexplicably left the road on the same curve where his mirror passenger had warned him. Most involved collisions with semi-trucks traveling too fast for conditions. The most recent accident had happened exactly 1 year before Corbin's encounter. A woman named Sarah had died when her car was forced off the road by a speeding truck. The accident report noted that Sarah had managed to avoid a head-on collision, but died when her car rolled down an embankment. Sarah had spent her final moments trying to save someone else's life, and apparently she was still trying. Ezekiel was driving from Chicago to Milwaukee in January 2019 for a job interview, leaving around 11 p.m. to avoid traffic and arrive fresh for his morning meeting. He'd borrowed his brother's car for the trip, a reliable sedan with a decent sound system that he planned to use for some music to keep him alert during the 90-minute drive. About 30 minutes into the trip, while driving through a particularly empty stretch of I-94, the radio began acting strangely. Ezekiel had been listening to a classic rock station when it suddenly switched to talk radio. He reached to change it back, but before his hand reached the dial, it switched again to a country station. He assumed it was some kind of electrical glitch, maybe loose wiring or interference from a cell tower. But when he tried to manually tune to his preferred station, the radio wouldn't respond to his inputs. The buttons worked, but whatever station he selected would immediately change to something else. Over the next few minutes, the radio cycled through dozens of stations rapidly, never staying on any frequency for more than a few seconds. Static, music fragments, talk show snippets, news reports, all blending together in a chaotic audio collage. Then it found a station that made Ezekiel's skin crawl. A man's voice, speaking clearly through the speakers, addressing him directly by name. "Ezekiel, you need to take the next exit." He nearly swerved off the road in shock. There was no way a radio station could know his name or location. He fumbled for the radio controls, trying to change stations, but nothing happened. The voice continued, "I know you can hear me, Ezekiel. Take exit 344 in 2 miles. There's something you need to see." The voice was calm, conversational, as if they were old friends having a chat, but Ezekiel had never heard it before. It didn't sound like any radio personality he knew, and the tone was too intimate, too personal for broadcast radio. "I'm not taking any exits," Ezekiel said aloud, feeling foolish for talking to his radio.
"You will," the voice replied immediately, as if it had heard him. "Because if you don't, you'll never make it to Milwaukee alive."
That's when Ezekiel realized something that terrified him. There was no static, no background noise, no station identification. The voice was coming through his speakers with perfect clarity, but it wasn't coming from any radio station. He tried turning the radio off. The voice continued. He tried changing the volume. The voice remained at the same level regardless of the volume setting. He even tried unplugging his phone, thinking maybe it was connected via Bluetooth, but nothing changed.
"Exit 344, Ezekiel. 1 mile now."
Against his better judgment, Ezekiel found himself slowing down as the exit approached. Not because he intended to take it, but because something was making his foot ease off the gas pedal. His leg moved without his conscious control, gradually reducing speed.
"Good choice," the voice said approvingly.
Ezekiel forced his foot back down on the accelerator and drove past the exit. The voice in his radio became agitated.
"That was a mistake, Ezekiel. A serious mistake."
The radio began cycling through stations again, but now each station was playing the same thing. Recordings of car accidents. Screeching tires, metal crushing, glass breaking, people screaming. Every station, same horrific audio. Then his car started malfunctioning. The headlights dimmed, then brightened to blinding intensity. The windshield wipers activated on their own. The air conditioning began blasting freezing air, then switched to scalding heat.
"Take the next exit, Ezekiel, or it gets worse."
The steering wheel began vibrating violently. The speedometer needle swung wildly between 0 and the maximum reading. Warning lights flashed across the dashboard in patterns that spelled out words. Stop. Turn. Listen.
"What do you want?"
Ezekiel shouted over the chaos. Everything stopped. Radio silence, normal dashboard, perfect vehicle operation. Then the voice returned, quieter now, almost sad. "I just want to go home, Ezekiel. I've been trying to get home for 3 years." The radio display, which normally showed the station frequency, now showed text scrolling across the screen. James Morton, died mile marker 67, January 15, 2016. Ezekiel looked at the mile markers. He was approaching marker 67. "I was driving to Milwaukee for a job interview," the voice continued, "just like you. Hit black ice right here. Car went into the median, flipped 4 times, died instantly," they said. The radio display showed more text. "Please take exit 344. Tell my wife I made it home." Ezekiel pulled over at mile marker 67. In his headlights, he could see gouges in the median where a vehicle had clearly left the road. The metal guardrail was still damaged, never properly repaired. He turned around and drove back to exit 344, following GPS directions to the address the radio display provided. It led him to a small house where a woman answered the door despite the late hour, as if she'd been expecting someone. "Are you James's wife?" Ezekiel asked. She started crying immediately. "How did you know? How did you find me?" Ezekiel spent an hour explaining what had happened. James's wife, Patricia, said she'd been receiving strange phone calls for 3 years, voices on the line that sounded like her husband trying to tell her he was coming home. When Ezekiel drove back to Milwaukee, his radio worked perfectly normal. But he never forgot the message James had asked him to deliver, or the relief in Patricia's voice when she finally knew her husband had found peace. Some voices travel farther than radio waves can reach.